Most of us think of plants as passive background characters in the story of life, quiet, rooted, decorative, easy to ignore. But imagine this: a plant is bitten by an insect, and within seconds, nearby plants begin producing defensive chemicals before they're touched. Another plant remembers a past threat and reacts faster the next time it appears. Some plants stop responding to harmless stimuli after repeated exposure, not because they're tired, but because they've learned it isn't dangerous. No brain, no nerves, no eyes, and yet sensing, signaling, adapting, remembering. That's the uncomfortable part. Because if intelligence doesn't require a brain, then our definition of intelligence might be far too small. Today, we're not asking whether plants think like humans. They don't. We're asking something much more interesting. What does intelligence look like when it doesn't look like us at all? This is where science gets strange, beautiful, and a little unsettling in the best way. Hello, beautiful listeners, and welcome back to Green Earth Essentials. I'm your host, Michelle Jackson. This show is where we explore the science, wisdom, and systems of the natural world through the lens of sustainability, holistic wellness, and deep respect for life on this planet. Here, curiosity leads, myths get gently examined, and wonder is always welcome, but we keep our feet on solid ground. In this episode, we're diving into the fascinating and often misunderstood topic of plant intelligence, what science actually shows about plant memory, communication, sensing, and awareness, and where the line exists between evidence and imagination. Because the truth is, plants don't need to resemble us to be extraordinary. They're already doing things that challenge how we understand intelligence itself. When we hear the word intelligence, most of us immediately picture a brain, a prefrontal cortex, neurons firing, problem solving like a tiny human. But what if that picture is too small, too human centered? Intelligence doesn't always look like thinking, reasoning, or remembering facts. In nature, intelligence can simply be the ability to respond effectively to your environment. Survival requires sensing, adapting, and communicating, whether or not there's a brain involved. Plants are masters of this kind of intelligence. They recognize patterns in light and water. They remember past stresses like drought or insect attacks and adjust their future responses. They communicate with neighbors, sharing chemical warnings or trading resources through underground fungal networks. None of this means plants have emotions or inner monologues. They aren't thinking the way we think, but they are aware in their own biological language. They read their world, respond to it, and even without nerves or a brain, learn from it. By stepping outside our human ego and redefining intelligence as adaptive responsiveness, we begin to see plants not as passive decor or dumb organisms, but as systems with their own subtle, astonishing ways of interacting with the world. Intelligence is no longer about humans at the center, it's about life itself in all its varied and unexpected forms. If intelligence in plants is about adaptive responsiveness, then memory is where things start to feel genuinely uncanny, because plants demonstrate it without a single neuron in sight. One of the most well known experiments involves Mimosa pudica, often called the sensitive plant. When touched, it quickly folds its leaves inward as a defense mechanism. Researchers repeatedly drop these plants from a small, harmless height. At first, the leaves closed every time, but after repeated drops with no actual harm, the plants stopped responding. They didn't conserve energy because they were tired. They changed behavior because the stimulus had proven non threatening. Even more remarkable, when tested weeks later, the plants still remembered the experience. They responded differently based on past exposure. No brain, no nerves, just experience imprinted into biological response. Plants also exhibit something called stress priming. When exposed to drought, heat, or pathogens, plants often respond faster and more effectively the next time the same stress appears. This isn't anticipation in a conscious sense. It's the adjustment of internal signaling systems, chemistry, and gene expression based on past conditions. And then there's epigenetic memory. Environmental factors can alter how certain genes are expressed, and in some cases, those changes are passed on to future generations. A parent plant exposed to stress may produce seeds that are better prepared for similar environments. Memory here becomes something larger than an individual. It becomes evolutionary preparation. This kind of memory isn't recollection. Plants aren't remembering events, they're remembering conditions. Experience leaves a mark, and biology adjusts accordingly. It's eerie not because plants are thinking, but because learning itself turns out to be far more ancient, subtle, and widespread than we ever imagined. If memory is how plants learn from experience, communication is how that experience spreads beyond the individual. And this is where plant intelligence becomes unmistakably collective. When a plant is attacked by an insect, it doesn't suffer in silence. Many plants release volatile chemical compounds into the air, signals that nearby plants can detect. Those neighboring plants may begin producing defensive chemicals of their own, sometimes before they're ever touched. What looks like anticipation is really shared information moving through the environment. Below ground, communication becomes even more intricate. Roots release chemical signals into the soil that influence surrounding plants, attract beneficial microbes, and coordinate growth patterns. These underground messages help regulate competition, cooperation, and survival in ways we're still in the early stages of understanding. Inside the plant itself, electrical impulses travel through tissues, linking leaves, stems, and roots into an integrated signaling system. These signals help coordinate responses to damage, light changes, or stress, allowing the plant to act as a unified whole rather than a collection of separate parts. Then there are the mycorrhizal networks, fungal threads that connect plant roots beneath the soil. Through these networks, plants can exchange nutrients, share warnings, and support seedlings that haven't yet established strong roots. This isn't altruism in a moral sense, it's ecological intelligence. Systems evolve to increase resilience across the entire community. When intelligence operates at this scale, it no longer belongs to any one organism. It emerges from relationships. And in the plant world, survival has always been a shared endeavor. What makes this communication even more fascinating is that it isn't symbolic the way human language is. Plants aren't sending messages in an intentional sense. They are releasing information rich signals that other organisms have evolved to read. A chemical released under insect attack isn't a warning in the emotional sense, it's data. Nearby plants don't decide to respond. Their biology simply shifts in response to the signal. In this way, plant communication resembles an ancient internet of cause and effect. Information moves through air, soil, roots, and fungi, not because plants want to talk, but because life has learned how to listen. Intelligence here isn't centralized, it's distributed, relational, and deeply ecological. Plants may not have eyes, ears, or a nervous system, but they are astonishingly skilled at sensing danger, and the ways they detect it are both subtle and at times almost eerie. Some plants can sense vibrations. Certain species can detect the tiny vibrations caused by a caterpillar chewing on their leaves, and they respond by producing defensive chemicals even before the insect moves to another part of the plant. Others respond to general environmental vibrations like footsteps or rainfall, adjusting their leaves, stems, or growth patterns in real time. Touch is another line of defense. The sensitive plant Mimosa pudica snaps its leaves shut at the slightest disturbance, while Venus flytraps use specialized hairs to count touches, ensuring they only close when prey is present. This kind of precision is a form of environmental intelligence, response tuned to avoid wasting energy. Light cues also signal danger. Plants can detect sudden changes in light that indicate shading by other plants or unexpected exposure that might make them vulnerable. And chemicals released by damaged leaves or roots communicate threats not only internally but also to nearby plants, priming them to respond faster. Even without nerves or consciousness, plants integrate these signals and adapt. They don't experience fear, but they do exhibit an extraordinary awareness of conditions, a living, responsive attentiveness honed by millions of years of evolution. Watching this in action can feel almost like witnessing a form of silent intelligence that is entirely its own. At some point, curiosity led humans to ask a different question. What if we could listen to plants? Researchers and artists began attaching electrodes to leaves and stems, not to record sound, but to measure tiny electrical changes inside the plant. These electrical fluctuations are real. Plants use them to coordinate internal responses to light, touch, injury, and stress, much like signaling systems in animals, though far slower and very different. Those electrical signals can be translated, sonified into audible sound. Changes in voltage become changes in pitch, rhythm, or tone, and suddenly what was invisible becomes something we can hear. This is where things often get misunderstood. The sounds aren't music the plant is intentionally making. They aren't emotional expressions. They're translations, data converted into sound so that human senses can perceive biological activity that normally operates below our awareness. But even when framed correctly, the experience can feel uncanny. As a plant responds to light, touch, or environmental changes, the sounds shift, patterns emerge, rhythms change. It feels like interaction, even though what we're really witnessing is responsiveness made audible. What this reveals isn't plant emotion, it's plant activity. Dynamic, responsive, constantly adjusting. When people describe these sounds as communication or expression, they're responding emotionally to the experience, not uncovering new evidence of plant consciousness. And that distinction matters. Listening to plants this way doesn't prove they feel or think, but it does reinforce something important. Plants are not inert. They are electrically alive, continuously sensing and responding to their environment in ways far more complex than we once imagined. In a sense, these recordings don't let us hear plants speak, they let us hear biology in motion, and that alone is extraordinary. As plant research becomes more visible, it's not surprising that the most extraordinary findings travel the fastest and often change shape along the way. Claims that plants feel emotions, respond emotionally to music, or possess consciousness tend to spread not because people are gullible but because these ideas are deeply appealing. They take complex biological processes and translate them into human language that feels familiar and comforting. But here's where it's important to slow down. When scientists observe a plant responding to sound vibrations, what they're measuring are physical and chemical changes, altered gene expression, shifts in growth patterns, changes in cellular signaling. These responses don't indicate enjoyment, preference, or emotional experience. They indicate sensitivity. Similarly, when electrodes are attached to plants and their electrical activity is translated into sound, what we're hearing isn't expression, it's interpretation. Data converted into something audible so humans can perceive activity that normally exists outside our sensory range. The plant isn't performing, the equipment is translating. This distinction is important because when interpretation is repeated often enough, it can quietly turn into fact. A poetic metaphor becomes a scientific claim, and skepticism starts to sound like cynicism, even when it isn't. Being clear about evidence doesn't make the science colder. In fact, it makes it more remarkable. Plants don't need emotions or awareness to coordinate defenses, remember stress, or participate in complex ecological networks. They do these things through chemistry, structure, and time. Separating wonder from wistful thinking doesn't diminish curiosity, it protects it. It allows us to stay amazed without being misled and to trust science without stripping it of meaning. So, why does the idea of conscious plants pull at us so strongly? Why does it feel almost disappointing to hear that plants don't feel, don't think, don't experience the world the way we do? Part of this longing comes from how disconnected modern life has become. Many of us spend our days indoors, mediated by screens, interacting more with algorithms than ecosystems. In that context, the idea that plants might be aware, that they might somehow register our presence, offers a sense of relationship we're missing elsewhere. It suggests we're still participants in a living world, not just observers passing through it. There's also an ethical undercurrent here. If plants were conscious in a human like way, then harming them would feel more personal, and caring for them would feel morally reinforced. Anthropomorphizing plants can become a way of restoring weight and meaning to a world that often treats nature as expendable. This doesn't mean people want to be misled. It means they want to care deeply, and they're searching for a framework that makes that care feel grounded and justified. Another reason this idea resonates is that we're unsettled by intelligence that doesn't resemble us. When science shows that plants can remember, communicate, and adapt in complex ways, it creates a gap in understanding. Our instinct is to fill that gap with familiar concepts, emotion, awareness, intention, because that's how human meaning making works. There's something uncomfortable hiding beneath that impulse. If intelligence can exist without thought, without self awareness, then humans are no longer the sole reference point for complexity or value in the natural world. Life doesn't need to be witnessed by us to be intricate or significant. So, the desire to see consciousness in plants may not really be about plants at all. It may be about our hunger for connection, our grief over ecological loss, and our hope that the world is more alive than it sometimes feels. Recognizing that impulse doesn't make us naive, it makes us honest. At this point in the conversation, it's worth noticing what often arises when we sit with these ideas. There's usually a flicker of resistance. If plants can sense, remember, and communicate in their own ways, then where does that leave us? But this isn't about diminishing humanity. It's about loosening the frame. When we stop asking whether plants are like us and start asking what forms intelligence can take across life, something shifts. We move from comparison to relationship, from dominance to participation. And that shift is where science quietly begins to feel reverent. Reverence doesn't require imagination to outrun evidence. Plants don't need human emotions to matter. They don't need consciousness as we define it to be intelligent. They don't need inner experience to be worthy of care and protection. Their intelligence operates at a different scale entirely. It's systems level, shaped by evolution and refined over hundreds of millions of years. It's collective rather than individual, distributed through roots, soil, fungi, air, and time. Plants solve problems not by thinking about them, but by transforming themselves, adjusting chemistry, structure, and relationships to survive. There's something deeply humbling about that kind of intelligence. It doesn't announce itself or seek recognition. It works steadily, sustaining ecosystems that make all life possible, including our own. This is where science and spirituality don't need to compete. Understanding how plants truly function doesn't strip them of meaning, it anchors it. When we allow plants to be what they are, rather than what we wish them to be, our respect becomes steadier and our sense of connection becomes more grounded. Reverence rooted in truth is resilient, and the more we learn about plants, the more astonishing they become, without needing to be anything other than themselves. As we come to the end of this exploration, it becomes clear that the real issue was never whether plants are like us. The issue was that we've been using ourselves as the measuring stick. We expect intelligence to look like thinking. We expect awareness to look like feeling. We expect meaning to require consciousness, but life has never agreed to those terms. Not everything that is intelligent thinks. Not everything that responds feels. Not everything that adapts is conscious. And yet it is all alive in ways we are only beginning to understand. Plants remind us that intelligence can be quiet, that awareness can be distributed, that meaning can exist without narration or self-reflection. Their brilliance is not found in minds that wonder about the world, but in bodies that have learned how to belong to it. When we widen our definition of intelligence, we don't lose humanity, we gain humility. We begin to see life not as a hierarchy, but as a spectrum of strategies, each one exquisitely tuned to survival, cooperation, and community. If you enjoyed this episode and want to go deeper into these kinds of conversations, I invite you to follow me on Substack at substack.com/at Green Earth Essentials. That's where I share transcripts, reflections, and companion pieces that expand on the ideas we explore here. You can find the link in the episode description as well. Thank you for spending this time with me. This is Michelle Jackson signing off.